The air was a furnace blast, thick with the smell of pine resin and panic. Embers, like malevolent orange wasps, swirled in the superheated wind, stinging her exposed skin. Each breath was a gamble, a searing intake of smoke that clawed at her lungs. Below, the valley she had once called home was being erased, painted over with a rolling wave of incandescent orange. The roar was constant, a physical pressure that vibrated through the soles of her worn boots and up into her bones. It was the sound of a world ending. Elara did not look back. Her eyes were fixed on the dark slash in the granite face of the mountain ahead. Her hand was a knot in the coarse mane of the great sorrel horse trotting beside her, his breath coming in ragged, panicked snorts. "Almost there, Copper," she rasped, her own voice a stranger's, thin and dry. "Almost home." The horse trusted her. He always had.
While the deer had fled days ago, and the birds had fallen silent,
Copper had simply watched her, his large, intelligent eyes tracking her every move as she made her final preparations. He had felt the wrongness in the air, the oppressive weight of the brassy sky, but his faith was in the woman, not the world. Now, as cinders rained down and the very ground seemed to tremble with the fire's fury, he stayed with her, his powerful body a shield against the worst of the wind. They reached the entrance, a heavy, sod-covered door set deep into the rock. It looked less like a door and more like a patch of earth stood on its end. She fumbled for the latch, her fingers clumsy with haste. The thick iron bar, cool from the deep stone around it, was a shock to her heated skin. She threw her weight against it. It lifted. The heavy door swung inward with a whisper of balanced weight, revealing a rectangle of absolute, silent darkness. Cool, clean air washed over her, a benediction. It smelled of stone, damp earth, and stillness. It was the smell of survival. "In, boy, go on," she urged, pushing on Copper's flank. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his instincts screaming at the idea of entering a cave or the world burned. Then he looked at her, saw the calm certainty in her smoke-stung eyes, and stepped across the threshold into the dark. Elara followed, pulling the massive door shut behind them. The roar of the firestorm was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, dull thunder. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by a profound, life-giving chill. She leaned against the inside of the door, the thick timbers cool against her back, and slid to the floor. The darkness was total. The silence was a balm. For the first time in days, she could breathe. The shelter held. Her life's work held. And outside, the world that had cast her out was turning to ash. 10 years earlier, the world had been cold, not hot. The accusation came on a day when the wind had teeth and the sky was the color of old pewter. She was 14. Elara stood before the village council, a small figure wrapped in patched wool, her hands stained with dirt and her face set in a mask of stoic defiance. Between her and the council sat a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Elder Borin, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard seasons and harder decisions, pointed a gnarled finger at it.
"You were seen, hiding this, in the rocks by the frozen creek."
His voice was heavy with disappointment, the collective disappointment of a village that had just endured a winter of brutal scarcity.
"Is this true?"
Elara nodded once. She did not speak. There was little point. Borin's associate, a younger man named Fendril, unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay several strips of dried venison, hard as wood, and a small handful of withered berries. each one a jewel of hoarded sustenance.
A collective gasp went through the small crowd of villagers gathered in the longhouse.
It was not a great hoard, but in a winter where the communal stores had dwindled to salted fish and mealy oats, it felt like a king's ransom. It felt like a betrayal. "We share," Borin said, his voice low and dangerous. "That is the law. That is how we survive. Every hunt is for the village. Every berry is for the village. You took this. You hid it. For yourself." "No," Elara said, her voice quiet but clear. The single word hung in the smoky air.
"No?" Fendril scoffed.
"Then for who? A ghost?" "It was a test," she explained, looking only at Borin. "Grandmother told me stories about the cold breath of the mountain, places where the ice never melts. She said, if you find a place like that, you can keep food forever. I found a crack in the north face. The air that comes from it is always cold. I was seeing if the meat would keep. For the village, for next winter, so we would have a reserve." A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd, not of understanding, but of mockery. "The cold breath of the mountain," someone mimicked in a high, childish voice. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Borin held up a hand for silence. He looked at the girl, at her earnest, unblinking gaze, and saw not foresight, but the familiar sin of selfishness dressed in a child's fantasy. He had seen it before. People who thought they were cleverer than the community, who believed their needs superseded the whole.
It was a weed that had to be pulled early. "You are your father's daughter," he said, and the words were a condemnation.
Her father had been a dreamer, a man who had tried to build a water wheel in the wrong part of the river, wasting a season's labor before it was smashed by the spring thaw. He had died chasing a fanciful idea. Borin saw the same folly in Elara. "You speak of magic breath and hiding food that belongs to all. That is not the way. The way is the communal storehouse. The way is trust in the council." He stood, his authority absolute. "You have broken the law of sharing. You have put yourself before the village. You will no longer eat from the village stores. You will live apart, on the mountain. If its cold breath is so powerful, let it feed you." It was a sentence of exile. She was cast out, not from the valley itself, but from its heart, from the web of trust and shared labor that was its lifeblood. She was to live on the periphery, a ghost in her own home.
Elara did not cry. She did not beg.
She simply met the elder's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her young eyes. It was not anger. It was resolve. She turned and walked out of the longhouse, the laughter of the villagers following her into the biting wind. She had tried to explain a principle, and they had heard a fairy tale. She had offered them a future, and they had punished her for the past. Very well. She would build that future for herself. Her grandmother's words were not a fantasy, they were an observation. "The mountain breathes, little one," she used to say, her hands busy weaving a basket. "In summer, it exhales cold. In winter, it inhales warmth. Find a place where you can feel it, and you have found the mountain's cellar." Elara found it a month after her exile. It was a narrow fissure on the sheer, sunless north face, almost completely hidden by a curtain of hardy, ancient ivy.
When she pushed the foliage aside, a stream of frigid air flowed over her hand,
A current so distinct, it felt like stepping into a spring-fed creek. It was real. Her work began with the tools of a castaway, a sharpened stone, her bare hands, and time. The first year was spent simply widening the entrance. She clawed at the decomposed granite and shale, her fingernails breaking, her hands raw and bleeding. She used a stout branch as a lever to pry loose larger rocks, her small body straining with the effort. Every day, from sunup to sundown, she worked. The villagers, seeing her from afar, would shake their heads. "The mad girl is digging her own grave," they'd say. She acquired a broken pickaxe head from the village rubbish heap, a discard from a failed mining venture decades ago. She spent a week painstakingly fashioning a handle for it from a piece of seasoned ash, lashing it together with strips of deer hide. The tool became an extension of her will.
The sound of her work became the rhythm of her life. The sharp clink of the pick against stone, the scrape of rock being dragged, the soft thud as she built a retaining wall with the excavated debris. She was not just digging a hole, she was shaping a space. She learned the language of the rock. She saw the stress lines, the faults, the layers of geology that told a story millions of years old. She realized a square room would be weak. The weight of the mountain demanded an arch. Following a natural curve in the stone, she began to shape the ceiling into a high, graceful vault. This was the most dangerous work. Small shards of rock rained down, and more than once a larger piece broke free, forcing her to scramble away. But she learned to test the stone, to tap it and listen to the sound it made. A dull thud meant danger. A clear ring meant stability. The initial chamber took her 2 years to excavate. It was a space 10 paces long and 5 wide, with the ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand upright. The air within it was consistently cold, a permanent pocket of winter. But she knew this was not enough. A simple cave would become a damp, stagnant tomb. It needed to breathe. This was the secret her grandmother had only hinted at. The cold air needed to flow. She spent an entire summer observing, using the smoke from a small, smouldering bundle of herbs to trace the imperceptible air currents around the fissure. She discovered that the cold air was heavy, pooling at the lowest point. She needed an intake there and an exhaust higher up. She found what she was looking for higher up the mountain face. Another, smaller fissure, almost 100 feet directly above her main entrance. The task of connecting them seemed impossible. It would require carving a vertical shaft, a chimney, through solid rock. For the next 3 years, this was her singular focus. She built a rickety scaffolding of saplings inside her chamber. Lying on her back, she would attack the ceiling with her pick, chipping away at the stone overhead. It was torturous, grueling work. Dust and rock fragments rained into her eyes, her mouth, her hair. Her arms and shoulders ached with a fire that never ceased. Some days she would manage to deepen the shaft by only an inch. Slowly, painstakingly, the ventilation shaft crept upward. She became an expert in the rock's weaknesses, finding softer seams and exploiting them. She learned to use fire and water, heating a section of rock with a small, focused flame and then dousing it with cold water, causing it to crack and splinter. Inch by inch, foot by foot, she drove her tunnel toward the sky. The day she broke through was not dramatic. A small trickle of dirt fell, followed by a tiny shaft of pale light. She chipped away the remaining rock, and a column of cool, fresh air flowed down, pushing the stale air in the chamber out through the main entrance. She had done it. She had given her cellar lungs. The mountain could now breathe through her creation. Now she had to control the breathing. The lower entrance needed a door, but not just any door. It needed to be a plug, an insulator. She felled 2 thick pines, a feat that took her weeks of patient chopping with a hand axe. She learned to hew them into thick planks,
squaring them off with imprecise, powerful blows. She fastened them together with wooden pegs she carved herself, creating a door of immense thickness and weight. She built a heavy frame of stone and timber around the entrance, setting the door within it. To seal it, she packed the space between the two layers of planks with a mixture of dried moss, clay, and sod. When finished, the door was almost 2 feet thick.
Using a complex system of levers and the carefully placed counterweight made of a large netted stone, she was able to open and close it with manageable effort. It closed with a solid, satisfying thump, sealing the chamber in darkness and silence. The interior came next. She spent a year carving shelves directly into the stone walls, creating a natural, refrigerated pantry. She dug a small sump in a corner to collect the minimal condensation, ensuring the floor stayed dry. Near the entrance, she constructed a small antechamber with its own small flue, a place where a tiny fire could be lit for light or warmth without compromising the air in the main storage area. Finally, she began to stock it. This was the act for which she had been exiled, but now she did it openly, methodically. She became a master hunter and forager. She learned the ways of the deer and the rabbit. She knew which mushrooms were safe, which roots were nourishing, which berries would dry and keep. She built a small smokehouse to cure the meat from her hunts. Section to be continued. She filled clay pots of her own making with clean water from a high mountain spring and sealed them with beeswax. She stacked firewood in the antechamber. She filled sacks with dried oats and barley purchased with the pelts from her trapping. She laid in blankets, spare tools, lamps, and oil. She even stockpiled feed for Copper, the foal she had rescued after its mother was taken by a wolf. The horse was her only companion, a silent witness to her ceaseless labor. Her cellar was no longer just a hole in the ground. It was a system. It was a fortress. It was a promise she had made to herself 10 years ago, now fulfilled in 1,000 tons of rock and a decade of sweat. The villagers still saw her as the strange woman on the mountain, the hoarder, the tomb digger. They saw the heavy door and called it Elara's folly. They had no understanding of the thermal mass of the mountain, of the genius of the dual ventilation system, of the sheer, bloody-minded willpower it had taken to create. They saw a mad woman's obsession. Elara saw a guarantee of life. The signs began in the spring. It arrived like a fever, sudden and dry. The usual gentle rains never came. The creeks, normally boisterous with snowmelt, were timid trickles. The earth, usually soft and dark, was cracked and pale. By early summer, the heat was no longer a condition of the day, it was the state of the world. A relentless, suffocating blanket lay over the valley. The sun was not a golden disk, but a white-hot blister in a hazy, brass-colored sky. The air was still and thick, holding the heat long after dusk. At night, the rocks themselves seemed to exhale the day's warmth. Elara watched. She saw things the villagers, in their sweltering wooden houses, did not. She saw the deer coming down to the river to drink at midday, their usual caution burned away by thirst. She saw squirrels frantically burying nuts that were already baked in their shells. The birds were gone. The woods, usually a cacophony of life, had fallen into an eerie, watchful silence. Copper was her most reliable barometer. The big horse was miserable, his coat perpetually dark with sweat. He stood listlessly in the shade of the lean-to she had built for him, refusing to graze. He would stamp his feet and stare toward the high peaks, his nostrils flared, sensing the wrongness in the wind. Once a week,
Elara would walk to the edge of the woods, to a vantage point overlooking the village. She saw them trying to cope. They doused their roofs with buckets of water, a futile gesture that only seemed to steam in the oppressive heat. Fights broke out at the communal well as its level dropped daily. Their crops withered in the fields, the leaves turning yellow and crisp. They were trapped. Their homes of thick timber and sod roofs, designed to hold in warmth during the brutal winters, had become convection ovens. One afternoon, Elder Borin rode past the path to her homestead. He was leading a train of mules laden with empty water barrels. He looked thinner, his face etched with a new kind of worry. He saw her standing by the tree line, a solitary, still figure. He stopped. "The heat is hard on us all," he said. It was not an apology, but it was the closest he had come to acknowledging her existence in a decade. "The mountain is dry," Elara replied, her voice even. "The springs are failing. The river will be next." Borin sighed, wiping a sleeve across his sweating brow. He glanced up at the heavy, sealed door of her cellar, visible on the mountainside behind her. "Still spending your days in that folly? You'd be better off helping us dig the well deeper." "My work is done," she said simply. He shook his head, a gesture of pity and frustration. "You and your father, always chasing shadows. The rain will come. It always does." He kicked his mule and rode on, a man clinging to the hope of precedent in a world that had abandoned it. The rain did not come. Instead, the fire came. It started with a flicker of lightning in the tinder-dry high country, a single spark in a world made of fuel. For a day, it was just a plume of smoke on the horizon. Then the wind shifted. A hot, furious wind swept down from the peaks, and the plume of smoke became a wall of flame that devoured the forest with an insatiable hunger. The firestorm hit the valley with the force of a physical blow. The roar was deafening, a constant, shrieking inferno. The heat wave that had plagued them for weeks was now a firebrand, hot enough to melt lead. Elara had already moved Copper into the antechamber of the cellar. As the first wave of superheated air rolled over her small homestead, she made her final dash, sealing the great door behind them. And then there was quiet. Inside the cellar, the world was transformed. The temperature dropped by 50 degrees in the space of 10 feet. The air, drawn down through the high ventilation shaft from deep within the mountain's core, was cool and clean. It tasted of stone and deep, ancient water. Elara lit a single tallow lamp in the antechamber. Its small, steady flame cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. Copper, his panic instantly subsiding in the cool and quiet, let out a long, shuddering sigh and began to nose at the sack of feed she had ready for him. She walked deeper into the main chamber. She ran her hand along the wall. The rock was cold, a vast and unshakable heat sink. The tons of stone she lived inside were absorbing the thermal energy of the apocalypse raging outside, and the effect on the interior was negligible. She checked a wooden thermometer she had carved and calibrated. It registered a stable 50 degrees. Outside, it was likely over 1,000. Her grandmother had been right. The villagers had been wrong. The mountain breathed, and it had given her its life. For 2 days, she and Copper lived in their stone sanctuary. The only indication of the hell outside was a low, continuous rumble that vibrated through the rock, and the faint, acrid smell of smoke that sometimes ghosted from the upper vent shaft before being whisked away by the constant, gentle airflow. She ate dried meat and hard biscuits. She talked to her horse. She slept, a deep and dreamless sleep, in the absolute silence and dark. She was not afraid.
she was prepared. On the third day, a new sound intruded. It was a frantic, desperate banging on the outer door. It was not the sound of the fire. It was the sound of knuckles on wood. Elara took a burning branch from the antechamber fire for a torch and went to the door. She listened. Muffled cries, choking coughs, human sounds. She hesitated for only a second. She heaved on the counterweight bar. With a deep groan, the heavy door swung inward. A wave of heat and the stench of a burned world washed in. Silhouetted against a hellish, orange-grey landscape of smoke and ruin were 4 figures. They stumbled forward and collapsed onto the cool stone floor of the entranceway, gasping and retching. Their clothes were scorched, their faces and hands blackened with soot. One of them looked up at her, his face a mask of pain, disbelief, and awe. It was Fendrel, the man who had mocked her in the longhouse 10 years ago. Behind him was his wife and 2 small children. "Water," he croaked, his throat raw. Elara said nothing. She went to one of the clay pots, broke the wax seal, and brought them water in a wooden cup. They drank like dying animals, their bodies shaking. "The village, it's gone," Fendrel whispered, looking around at the impossible haven. The cool air, the neatly stacked shelves, the calm horse watching them from the antechamber. All of it, burned. The root cellars became ovens. The smoke. We ran. We saw the door. We thought. His voice broke. Later that day, more came. A desperate, ragged trickle of survivors who had seen Fendrel's group heading for the strange door on the mountainside. Among them was Elder Borin. He was not a leader anymore. He was just an old man, his robes of office burned away, his face streaked with tears and ash. He stumbled into the cool darkness and stared at Elara, the girl he had exiled. He did not need to see the stockpiles of food and water. He did not need to understand the engineering. He only needed to feel the cool, clean air on his scorched skin. He only needed to breathe. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes fixed on hers. The dozen or so survivors in the chamber fell silent, watching. He stopped before her and seemed to shrink, the decades of authority falling from his shoulders like a heavy, useless cloak. "We called you mad," he said, his voice a hoarse wreck. "We drove you out. We laughed at your work." He gestured at the arched ceiling, the stone shelves, the impossible sanctuary. "This folly has saved us. I was wrong. We were all wrong." Elara looked at the old man, at the terrified families huddled on the floor of her life's work. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. There was no joy in being right when the cost was so devastating. There was only a profound, aching sadness. "The mountain is hot," she said, her voice quiet. "Get some rest. The fire will pass." She turned away from him and went to check on Copper, leaving the elder standing in the middle of the room, a monument to the failure of conventional wisdom. When the firestorm finally burned itself out, it left behind a world of monochrome horror. Elara opened the door to a landscape of black and grey. The vibrant green valley was gone, replaced by a carpet of white ash dotted with the charred skeletons of trees. The village was a collection of blackened foundations and fallen chimneys. The river was a sluggish, grey ribbon choked with soot. The air, though no longer burning, was thick with the funereal smell of a world cooked to death.
Her small hut was gone, of course, vaporized. Everything she owned, save for what was in the cellar, had been erased. But the cellar itself was untouched. The sod on the door was scorched, but the wood beneath was merely warm.
In the days that followed, the cellar became the heart of what was left of the community. The survivors, numbering no more than 30, huddled inside, their shock slowly giving way to the grim reality of their situation. They had nothing. No food, no shelter, no tools. Everything they had was what Ilara had spent a decade preparing. She organized them. There was no discussion of leadership, it was simply assumed. She was the one who had foreseen this. She was the one who knew what to do. She rationed the food and water. She tended to the burned and the sick with salves and tinctures she had prepared. They began to ask her questions. At first, they were simple. How is it so cool in here? Then they became more complex. Borin, his pride burned away, sat with her like a student. "The ventilation," he said, pointing a shaky finger toward the ceiling.
"How did you know?"
"The mountain told me," she explained patiently, as she had tried to explain as a child.
"The north face never sees the sun. The rock deep inside stays cold all year. It's heavier than warm air. If you give it a path, it will flow downward. The upper vent lets the warmer air inside escape." She explained the concept of thermal mass, how the sheer bulk of the stone acted as a massive buffer against temperature change. She explained why the arch was stronger than a flat roof. She was not just a survivor. She was a library of lost knowledge. The knowledge of reading the land, of listening to it, of working with it instead of against it. The villagers who had spent their lives forcing the land to their will, ploughing it, timbering it, damming it, listened with a new, desperate humility. They had built their world for one kind of hardship, the cold, and had been utterly destroyed by its opposite.
Ilara had prepared for everything. They began to venture out into the blackened world, led by her. She showed them how to find water by digging in certain parts of the riverbed. She found edible roots that had survived underground. She taught them how to make charcoal. Under her quiet, competent guidance, the ragged band of survivors began the slow, arduous task of not dying. The knowledge transfer was the most profound change. Fendrel, who had once scoffed at her, now followed her everywhere, learning how to test rock for stability, how to read the subtle signs of the land. They began to plan, not to rebuild the old village, but to build a new one, a better one.
"We need more cellars," Borin stated one evening, his voice firm with new purpose. "Like this one. Every home must have one."
Ilara nodded. "I will teach you." And so the work began again. The sound of pickaxes on stone once more echoed in the valley. But this time, it was not a solitary effort.
It was the sound of a community, reborn from the ashes, working together under the tutelage of the woman they had once cast out. They were no longer digging a folly. They were digging their future. Years passed. The valley healed. A slow, tentative green returned, sprouting from the ash-fertilized soil. A new village grew, not in the old location, but higher up the slopes, nestled against the protective granite of the mountain. The houses were different now. They were built of stone and earth, partially dug into the hillside to take advantage of the ground's insulating properties. And from each home, a stone-lined passage led back to a deep, vaulted cellar, carved into the mountain itself, each one a smaller, simpler copy of Ilara's original design. Ilara never took a title. She was not an elder or a leader in any official sense. She was simply Ilara. But her word was law, her knowledge the foundation upon which their new world
was built.
The cellar she had built, the first cellar, became a revered landmark, the communal storehouse and the ultimate refuge. It was kept stocked and ready, a permanent testament to the catastrophe that had reshaped them. It saved them again, 7 years after the fire, during the winter of frozen stars, a blizzard so fierce that it buried the old valley floor under 20 feet of snow and froze the river solid to its bed. While families in the old days would have huddled in their homes, slowly freezing as their firewood ran out, the new villagers simply retreated to their interconnected cellars. They lived for a month in the calm, stable, 50-degree chill of the mountain's heart, safe and warm enough with ample food, until the storm broke. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, an older Elara stood at the entrance of the first cellar. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves. Her hair was streaked with grey, and her face was lined not with worry, but with a deep, abiding calm. Beside her stood Copper, his own coat faded and his muzzle white with age. His head rested gently against her shoulder. She looked down at the thriving village, at the smoke curling from the stone chimneys, at the children playing in the fields where a forest had been reborn. She was no longer the outcast, the mad girl, the hoarder. She was the founder, the woman who had listened to the mountain. The mountain had taught her a lesson the village had forgotten, that the greatest abundance is not what you have today, but what you have prepared for tomorrow. The villagers had once accused her of hiding a handful of meat, a selfish act in their eyes. But they had come to understand the deeper truth she had known even as a child. Sometimes, the act of hiding something away, of creating a reserve against a future no one else can see, is not selfishness. It is the most profound and selfless form of care.